Hi! This week we're making this lovely dress that I'm currently wearing. Obviously, project went pretty well, but it took a lot of work to get there. So if you would like to join me on my first make of 2023, let's get into it. When I was doing my wrap up a couple weeks ago, last week, yesterday, I don't know, recapping all the projects from last year, I realized how long it has been since I came up with this design. It was the first thing I ever drew on the croquis I made of myself. It was just time, man. It was time. This was definitely an occasion where I was very thankful that I did workshop a couple of the ideas on the computer and even set aside like what color bias tape I had, because there were 2 shades of orange and I knew I did like a testing process when I first put this together. Got my little swatch here too, and not that I was gonna forget what fabric was going into the blue fox dress, but super handy. And now I have like a little diary of the thing that I made, because the videos I post every week aren't enough. It's been that long since I designed that sketch. I've had this fabric set aside since before I did the initial mocking up of the dream dress. When I made the otter one, was it over a year ago now? Was that 2021? I think it was. Just being transparent for how long I have had this idea sitting around. I had set aside a matching zipper at some point. My final decision was to make a snap front button-up situation. As I mentioned in last week's video, this style sundress, if you call it a sundress, I'm not really sure what category this falls into, but I have always wanted to make something like this and also wear it because I don't own any like this, and I love it. It was a challenge, but is that not what we're here to do, is learn and overcome obstacles we put in our own way? So yes, I tossed aside the zipper and definitively decided we're going button-up route. This meant we had to reconfigure the pattern a little bit because this one that I have is set up for a center back zipper. I had this pattern piece for the initial straps for this, which obviously I didn't end up using, but I really liked the width of it as far as the button placket that I was imagining. I just measured it, and so instead of cutting the front center bodice piece on the fold, I cut out 2 separate pieces, still cut with the fabric folded underneath but not on the fold, if you know what I mean. So I was cutting out both sides at the same time to make sure they were mirror images of each other, and I just added 1.5 inches along that center line, the straight edge, the easiest spot to add 1.5 inches. So this meant if I folded that under 3/4 of an inch, there was still going to be the additional 3/4 of an inch on the front side. Then the back piece, because it used to be cut in 2 pieces, now that can actually be cut on fold, but because we're not attaching the 2 halves together anymore, we have to remove the seam allowance. So I laid the pattern piece on the fold of the fabric, like on the actual folded edge, and I like shimmied it up about 1/2 inch because I have notes on all of these pieces that say 1/2 inch seam allowance, which is very helpful for these types of alterations. Then yeah, cut that out on the fold. As for the side front bodice pieces, those didn't need any alterations because they aren't getting affected by either the center front or the center back lines. These have what's called a princess seam. Instead of having 2 bust darts to take care of the fullness that may be happening, it's just like one single curve that goes down, and I really prefer this method anyway. I don't know why, it just seems to suit my torso a little better. As you'll see once I'm actually sewing these together, it can be like a little tricky to put opposing curves together, so I do make sure that I actually notch these seams, where I don't necessarily mark every single notch and dot and everything on every pattern piece that I cut out. But I know that these ones are really important, so we're doing it. Ooh, but there are small darts, I mean they're long, but they're narrow darts on the back bodice piece. There's one on either side of my spine. So I did mark the notches of the bottom of the legs there, and then used my thread marking tool to mark that center dot. I do find this to be like the easiest method for marking dots like this that aren't getting a cut or anything in them, because chalk can get brushed off where you're literally stabbing thread through the same exact spot on the fabric on both layers. So there's no way it's not going to be an exact match. Speaking of, without intention, but I'm very thankful for this happy accident, I managed to cut the front bodice pieces in a way that the fox faces are going to line up, because certain patterns, it's more important than others for the print to overlap correctly, and I think this would have been very distracting if I hadn't done that. So thankfully the sewing gods were with me, and it just went that way by happenstance. Seeing that was a good reminder that, like, let's be aware of that when we're cutting out the skirt pieces as well. But let us finish up with the bodice before we jump ahead. I wanted to sew up all of the seams here and just do a little test fit because I just wanted to check my work and make sure that the math I was doing was correct. Whatever it is about my brain wiring, I am very good at making super obvious mistakes. I misread something or I forget to double something. I just wanted to check it now before I got further into the project / found out I messed up and got so mad I threw it in the trash kind of thing. But everything went fine. I didn't completely wreck the dress already. So a note here about the fit is that otter dress, the dream dress I made eons ago apparently, I did put that on to give a little test fit and make sure that it was still comfortable and like would actually still fit me, because that's what I made with these exact pattern pieces, so I knew it would give me a similar result with a similar type of fabric. That was helpful. Also, I do this thing where I convince myself that I don't still fit in things that I made for me, even though I made that for me off of my own measurements, and I'm still within the same range as I was when I did that. So why it wouldn't fit, I don't know, but my brain convinces me of these kinds of things and I have to prove it wrong sometimes, and that's okay. There's an easy way to get empirical evidence dress does fit. So let's make another one. Also, speaking of checking your work, a clue I may have been neurodivergent as a youth would have been, I mean, I'm still neurodivergent, but a clue when I was younger would have been whenever I did math. I was actually like pretty good at math. Like I got all of my high school math classes done freshman year so that I didn't have to do it for the rest of my interim there. I would come up with the correct answer, but sometimes, not always, I would kind of go a different route to get there than what the teacher had explained to us or what everybody else did if we just kind of had to wing it. Like I had workarounds, because if I got stuck somewhere, and just take a little slightly more circuitous route or just do some weird stuff off to the side and then still have notes about everything, but I wouldn't go on the same journey to get to the answer as everybody else. And I got reprimanded quite frequently in a lot of those classes. Thankfully, one of my teachers, it was the hot geometry teacher that everybody had a crush on, was actually like super understanding. And I don't know if he himself was neurodivergent, but he didn't give me negative marks for still getting the same answer. Like, it was obvious I wasn't cheating or anything. Anyways, there is a little math in sewing, but in general, you don't have to deal with it that often, and I am thankful every day for that. Oh, and right, as far as the bodice assembly, even for the test fit, I did press everything out. Yes, I should have thoroughly pressed everything before I started cutting out in the first place in case there was some rogue shrinkage. But I did pre-wash this fabric when I got it before I stored it away, so at least we're doing some things properly. Thankfully, there wasn't much in the way of shrinking anyway. I did compare like the left and right side before and after, and everything lined up the same, so we're good, we're in the clear. But a thing to be aware of if you come into some troubles when you're fitting stuff is like possibly if you press it, especially with a lot of steam, that could be a reason. Other prep steps I did for the bodice pieces before sewing them all together was putting in the darts on the back bodice. What I like to do is fold it, obviously right sides together, so we're sewing on the inside of the piece. Fold it so that at one end you have your thread marked dot or chalked dot, however you're marking your dots. And then the little legs that you notch at the bottom of the pattern piece are sandwiched together. Then I'll lay that flat. You can press it here if you want, but since I'm gonna press it after anyway, I don't tend to do it beforehand. And then I take a ruler and I mark a chalk line, because when I'm sewing a straight line but the edge is not staying straight, I have a harder time keeping it straight and I don't want it to be like wavering, so chalk line is helpful. I don't mark or even pin a lot of things when I'm sewing, but this is something I try to be really diligent with because it can affect the shape of the thing so drastically. Then I start from the bottom, like the wider part of the dart, and I sew up. I do smaller stitches, and then once I get to that end point where that thread marking is, I taper it right to the edge, and then I do one stitch past the end, and then I pull it off the machine and leave a little extra for the strands, and then I tie a couple square knots just to secure it, rather than doing back tacking and having like a bulk of thread at that top point, because you want it to be like really smooth and clean. So if you're getting like a lot of puckering at the end of your darts, maybe try doing that. And then yeah, I press them towards the center, I think is how you're supposed to do it. I don't know how much it matters. I did press the darts on a seam roll just because there's like the littlest bit of shaping with this. Not much in the way of a curve though, so I could have done this flat. I don't know. The seam roll just seemed like a better option. Also, I never use it, so I figured just give it some attention. Then I serged that straight edge of each front piece, so what's going to be the inside edge of the placket, and folded that over the 3/4 of an inch. It was during this assembly stage that I entertained the idea of not lining the top, because I do want this to eventually be a summer dress. Now is not the time of year to be making summer dresses, but at least it'll be ready for warmer weather once it comes back. I just wanted like something nice and lightweight and give it like a little more wiggle room up top, because there's usually a little bit of stretch to quilting cotton like this, but once you line it, even with something with similar stretch, when you double up stuff like that, it's gonna give it less of that wiggle room. So I just wanted this to be as comfy as possible. This did end up presenting one problem, is I had to figure out how to finish the princess seams since I wouldn't have a lining to enclose all of that. And I still went about the princess seams in my usual way, which is, as I mentioned, you're lining up opposing curves. This is where those notches come in real handy. I pin in those two specific spots, and then obviously you're lining up the two ends of the pieces. And especially when you are between the notches where there's the most curve to the princess seam, kind of need to pull the fabric a bit. This is called easing, where you're not causing any puckering or gathering or anything like that, but you are eking out a little bit more from one side of the fabric to get it to lay flat against like a slightly longer edge of fabric. Just make sure you're pulling against your own hands, like have one hand at the back and one hand at the front, and pull against each other rather than pulling on the needle. It can bend it, it can break it, it can mess with the stitch length and all that stuff. So I know it's tricky, and I didn't quite understand what that meant, pull against your own hands, when someone was trying to explain it to me. But then once it clicked, and it's wildly helpful. I just do it by default. I don't even really think about it. Ooh, and speaking of it not being summertime, it is still pretty chilly. It was too cold for wearing this dress outside like I was. You gotta do what you gotta do for fashion. I'm not gonna wait 6 months to take photos of this to show y'all. Anyway, once the princess seams were sewn together, I then took this notching tool that I lost track of but did find eventually. I was looking for it to do the notches on the pattern cutting out process to start with. And this is the seam that's my favorite on a bodice, where it is a pain in the butt. You know, I do small stitches, I take my time, I go very slow. I really try to finesse it. Who is she? But I like it because this is like the one that turns it into a 3-dimensional object from a 2-dimensional one for me. Princess seams just add so much shape, and it is so cool that you can do that with fabric. It's magical. Anyways, once I had the notches done, you know, I wasn't notching all the way up to the seam, but you can go like pretty far into your seam allowance when you're notching things, because you're trying to get that seam to lay flat. When it's curved, you need that extra give along the seam allowance. But this is where finishing those seams is important, because there's way more fraying opportunities with stuff like this. But we'll get to how I tackled that at the end. So to press this out, I swapped out my seam roll for my tailor's ham. It can be real finicky. I do a probably very unsafe thing, actually a definitely unsafe thing, and I put the sewing ham between my thighs and hold it there, because I have a hard time wrangling the ham on the ironing board or on the counter or whatever. So this is my solution to that. And yeah, it's not smart. It is dangerous. Maybe don't do this. I did in fact almost melt my pants to my leg during this. So yeah, would not advise. Once that seam was pressed open from the inside, I flipped it over and pressed again from the outside just for extra crispness. That way you can see if there's any part that isn't like laying completely flat. Then over to probably the easiest seam in this entire project, which is the side seams. I just sewed them together, pressed them with the seams towards the back, and then serged it, or I probably serged it before I pressed it, but you get it. Then it was time for the test fit, and seeing that like the pattern matching was actually gonna work and everything was looking pretty good so far. This is where there were some design choices to be made, and I used my dress form, which I don't use very often, and I set up the bodice on there. I had forgotten that I shrank it down to its smallest size so that I could display some garments that I was selling that aren't my size, they're for smaller ranges. And every time I have to do adjustments, certain wheels I have to turn, it feels weirdly invasive. Like, I know it's an inanimate object, but I still feel like I am intruding on its personal space. Oh, also, here's me forgetting that I can't stand up fast or I get a wicked head rush and feel super lightheaded and dizzy. Thankfully it goes away pretty quick, but every time. It happens every time. If I stand up from this chair too quick, it will happen then. All right, this is where I needed to decide, am I doing a lining? No. Am I going to put some other kind of facing? No, because I've hated doing that in the past. The original pattern just calls for like a 2.5-inch facing, and I hated it. That's why I started doing a full lining to begin with. So ultimately I decided, shockingly, I was gonna go with my original design from my sketchbook and use this orange bias tape. Pretty fun, kind of noodling around to see what tactic was gonna make this work the way I wanted it to. So I ultimately decided that I would do a strip of bias tape along the underarm on each side, and then if I was smart about this, I could start a bias tape strip at one edge of the front center, curve it along the front until it overlapped with that underarm bias tape, then make a strap, which I have the measurement from previous versions of the dress, which is 12 inches, and I didn't need to add the seam allowance or any of that stuff to it. So just continuing the strap up and over the shoulder, then along the back, up and over the other shoulder, and then back down to the opposite side front center piece. So that was just one continuous loop, and I was actually like really excited that I figured this out because I think it looked really cool and it was very satisfying to put together. I also knew it was going to take a lot of finagling, so I put off doing that until I did almost everything else on the dress. And then before I did anything else, as soon as I took it off the dress form, I should have done this before I put it on the dress form, I stay stitched all of the curves, because if you have a super curvy section, which the entire top part of this dress is all curves, things can get warped and misshapen and like stretched out and just look weird and misshapen. So doing just basting length stitch, like a 1/4 inch in, helps preserve that curve. Then it was time to work on the skirt, which I have a really in-depth gathered skirt video as far as like how to make your own pattern. It's just rectangles. You don't even need to make a pattern for it. You can just measure it out on the fabric itself. But how to figure out the size rectangles and everything, I did all that same math. Actually, I cheated because I've done all of this before and I have notes from previous dresses, so I just copied that. But how I got to those numbers is the same approach I took in that video. So I'll put a card up here if you want to watch that. It probably sounds daunting, thinking like, I gotta make my own pattern. Again, you don't even need the pattern pieces for it. It's just rectangles. It's super easy, I promise. The hardest part for me is like flipping the waistband over and making that look nice, but even then, it's just straight lines, so you can do it. Promise, promise. I think I could have put any style skirt down here. I didn't realize until now, because I didn't read all of my notes, that I had suggested to myself to maybe do a circle skirt instead of a gathered skirt. A circle skirt does end up using a lot of fabric, but so does a gathered skirt. So I don't know which one would have weighed more, but I did decide on the gathered skirt. If nothing else, just so I didn't have to hem a curved edge and just have like a nice easy straight one to deal with. So I have a 31 to 32 inch waist and then a 41 to 42 inch hip. One width of 45 inch wide fabric is not going to work if I want it gathered at all, because if I account for seam allowance, like that's barely gonna fit over my butt. So I added a second panel of the full width of the fabric. So I have 2 panels that are 18 inches long, because that's the length of the skirt I wanted, was like on the shorter side. That's from my high waist down. And then, yeah, the full width of the fabric. Where if I had had 60 inch wide fabric, maybe I could have gotten away with just like very lightly gathering it. And obviously you can add as much or as little fabric to this as you want. Oh, and I had one of the panels, one of the full width panels, kept it intact, but the second panel I cut that in half so that I could have one full panel for the back of the dress, then that ended at the side seams, and then I had the left front and then the right front, because I was making this into a button-up, so there had to be a split somewhere, so I just, yeah, made that split up the center of the second panel. I had contemplated not adding pockets, because obviously it would have been a lot quicker to sew this together, but then I'd probably never wear this dress again, so I did cut out some pocketses. I didn't have any good navy fabric to go with it, so I did pick this like kind of pale creamsicle orange color, and I traced around my hand to make sure it was gonna fit. I also have big hands. Also, yes, I painted my nails for maybe the 5th or 6th time in my life. I haven't done this more than once in the past decade. I've never done dark nails like this. I've never done black nails. And here's the thing. I just never thought I was cool enough to do that. I thought that was for badasses only, and I did not fall into that category. But that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. So I'm letting myself do things like this. Wearing my battle vest more often. Wearing some dark lipstick. I want to let myself wear black jeans, because that was only for cool people. I don't know why I'm like this. I mean, I know I have a lot of self-esteem issues, but I am breaking all of that apart as best I can. But I didn't even realize this was a problem I had until I took out my nail polish, which all of that is very old, obviously, because I haven't done this in a long time. It got the job done. I'm not mad about how it came out. I already know how to like do it a little better, have a little more finesse to it for not having done this in years and years and years and having little to no practice. I'm not mad about it, and I like how this looks, so expect more painted nails. Also, it's like dedicated me time, which I'm not good at taking, and my therapist is always trying to get me to do more things like that. So good solution. Anyway, back to the pockets. I laid my hand down on the fabric. I was imagining this square being set into the side seam. So I left a straight edge towards the top, and then I just cut in a little below where my wrist was, and then just made a curve around my hand as big as I could. I honestly would have gone bigger if I had had more fabric than this, but thankfully I was able to eke out 4 layers. I used to have pockets only inserted in the side seam, so that would have involved like coming around my hand like this and going back across towards my wrist. I have learned that I really like having the pocket sewn into the waist seam just because it gives it that extra bit of support. It doesn't make the side seam like droop in when I have my phone or something in my pocket. So that is why the top edge of this is kept straight. Not all pocket patterns look like this, and just to explain what I'm doing with it so you weren't like, what the hell is happening right now? Then I pressed everything out and I dug out some ribbon because I wanted to reinforce that side seam edge of all the pocket pieces, because again, just keeps things from drooping. It's a little sturdier. So I serged that on, and then I serged the rest of the edges of each pocket piece. This is a little bit of a pain in the ass. I kind of don't like doing this part, but then I serged the short edges of all of the skirt pieces. If I wasn't doing pockets, I would wait to serge the skirt side seams until they had been sewn together, but because I'm adding the pockets in, they kind of need to be serged separately to get like a fully finished edge going on here. So then I laid my skirt pieces out. I lined up the pockets in the top corners of each one and made sure they were mirror images of each other. So then I stitched along just the side seam edge. I left everything else alone. Then I pressed that and had the seam allowance facing towards the pocket. Then once I did that for all 4 pockets, I laid the skirt panels right sides together with the appropriate pocket lining up to the appropriate other pocket. I am so eloquent. So then I stitched along the curved part of the pocket, and then I came in where that seam that I just did to attach the pocket to the skirt in the first place. I used to line up this pivot stitch like right where that line was, but I've learned if you just stitch a little bit past those lines, it's gonna like tuck the pocket in even further. We can test it out at the end because I wasn't like specifically trying to avoid you seeing the pocket. So basically I used to make this part unnecessarily hard on myself with worse results, and now everything is better for everybody involved. Then I continued down the rest of the side seam of the skirt. I did do a basting stitch across the top of the pocket bag just to keep that lined up. Things weren't flapping around all loosey-goosey while I was doing other things. I went to iron in the same width folds on the skirt front center as I did with the bodice front center, and realized I had pressed everything at 1/2 inch just because it's so out of habit for me, and realized all the math I did was based on a 3/4 inch wide placket. So I repressed everything at the correct width. Then it was time to do our gathering stitches. Yes, it's easier to show you with this bright pink thread, but also this thread is a little bit thicker than what I usually use. Having thicker thread, like stronger stuff for doing the gathering stitches because you're doing a lot of pulling, works out better. What would have actually been better is if I had had the thicker thread in like my bobbin and kept the regular weight top thread, so that it would have been very easy to pull one side over the other side. It can be kind of annoying figuring out top threads or bottom threads are better to pull. Like one wants to give more than the other sometimes, and it's just very obvious when you do 2 different weights of thread for the gathering stitches. And the way I put those in is I do the longest stitch I can. I leave some thread tails to start with, and then I stitch 1/4 inch in from the edge, that top edge of the skirt. And this is based on a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Adjust accordingly. But I do 1 row at 1/4 inch, and when I have pockets in my side seams like this, I separate my gathering sections into thirds instead of doing one huge loop for the whole thing, just because I don't want the top of the pocket getting gathered up. So that needs to get sewn down to the waistband after the gathering's done. So I kind of need to skip over it. So I end my stitches right before the side seam and then start another round of gathering stitches after the side seam. And I just did that for both sides and left tails on both ends of everything. And then I did a second row of all that same stuff 3/4 inch in. So I just went 1/2 inch in from that initial set of stitches, so that when I do my 1/2 inch stitch, it's going to go right between those two. Then it was time to actually do the gathering, which, as I said, you just pick either the top threads or the bottom threads. But once you pick one, you have to commit to it for that section. You can do either end of it, but if you start pulling on the top threads, you can't then start messing with the bottom threads. So just pick a side. It's going to be fine. The helpful part of doing this in 3 sections, it's just less stress on those threads. And then yeah, I just pull those parallel threads. I pull them at the same time so that all the gathering is even. And then I just keep bunching it up. This is a very satisfying tactile experience. I love doing this part. It's tedious and like time consuming, and you gotta zhuzh everything into place, and it like can get kind of annoying sometimes, but it feels so good on my hands. I'm not mad about it. So I bunch it up more than I need to, and then I lined it up against the section it was gonna cover, front center of the bodice to the side seam. That's where this front center of the skirt to the side seam is getting lined up against. And then I stretched out the gathered side until it was the same width as the bodice piece. Then this is a thing that I do because it keeps a lot of headaches from happening, but I don't know that I see other people do this. It's not like I was taught this or anything. Once I have the correct width of the panel of fabric, I tie knots at the end of my gathering stitches. So that way, when I'm adjusting and evening out all of the gathers between those 2 end points, I'm not accidentally letting out too much gathering and like stretching out the end of the panel or something. So it just keeps everything in the range it needs to stay in, and then I can just kind of zhuzh within that space. It's what works for me. Me do me, you do you. Then yeah, I did that for the other 2 sections of the skirt, and then it was time to sew it to the bodice. Like I said, going right between the gathering stitches at 1/2 inch. You just gotta be really careful, and you can zhuzh the gathers as you go if something gets like bunched up all weird. But you wanna watch out for puckers, and definitely sew from the gathered side just so you can see more of what's going on. Just take your time. It's okay if you go slow. Everything's fine. Definitely make sure to not stitch over any parts of the gathering stitches, or it's going to be very difficult to pull them back out. I thought about pressing the seam in a certain direction, but it just wants to stick up into the bodice. It's fine. I also think it's going to be bulky and uncomfortable if I press it down the other way, so this just makes my life easier. Oh, and rather than skipping over the pockets again, when I was sewing that 1/2 inch seam allowance, I had my pockets facing towards the front. Did I mention that when I was done sewing the pocket side seam situation down, that I pressed it towards the front? Because I want my pockets on the front part of my dress, not sticking towards my butt. That side seam got pressed. And then I was able to lay that flat, ungathered pocket bag top along that edge. It just kind of rested on top of that gathered section of the skirt on each side. So it went pretty easily. It probably looks a little more daunting than it actually is. As I always say, if I can do it, I promise you can do it. Then I serged all that together. I think the next step was reinforcing the placket. Yes, because I went to repress all of that. To reinforce the placket, I had debated doing interfacing and a variety of other things, which I can't even think of what else I would have done. So I just took some grosgrain ribbon. I stitched it just along the underside of that inner fold of the placket. So along that serged edge on the wrong side of the fabric. And I just did a zigzag stitch to keep it in place. I'm sure there are other ways I could have handled this. I probably could have serged it in place when I serged that center edge to start with, but I wasn't thinking that far ahead. I was improvising as we went. So it got done when it got done. Then just to fully have a nice clean edge to work with, I repressed the placket fold one more time, make sure everything was even, that I could line up the fox faces, and everything looked nice and crisp. Then I had to circle back to the bias tape, which was fun to put together once I was into it. But as always, before I start in on something, it's like really overwhelming to think about, and I get in my head and second guess. I don't know if I'm actually going to be able to do it. Spoiler alert, I was able to do it. Thing you can do with bias tape, because it's on the bias, which means it has stretch to it, as you'll see here, I laid down that armhole section, which has a lot of curve to it, and I shaped the bias tape before I stitched it on. I just pressed and stretched and kind of molded the bias tape along that curve, and it did exactly what I wanted it to do. It just kind of went into the shape I was trying to make. It was a lot easier than I remember it being, because I've done this before, but it's been a long time, and not for something this curvy either. I was making giant dinner plates for a Beauty and the Beast production. This is much more extreme of a curve than that was. So it worked. It worked better than I was expecting, to be honest. So I did that for both underarm seams, stitched the bias tape on with one edge right sides together, then I flipped it over, top stitched that underside down, and then pressed it again, and look at how nice it looks. Oh, this was one of my favorite parts of this project. Then it was time to tackle that one continuous loop of bias tape. Felt daunting at first, but it went fine. Same thing, I kind of steamed a curve into the bias tape, then I stitched that down, measured the 12 inches for the strap, marked where that ended, and then started on the back curve and did the same steam effect. Got that done, stitched that down. Once I didn't do the top stitching for any of this yet, just in case something went wonky and had to get unpicked. So then I measured out that second strap section, marked where that was going to end just with a pin, lined that up, and then did that same curving action for the rest of the front of the bias tape. And then I just left little tails at the end where the placket was going to be, because I knew once that was folded under, I could like hand stitch it down and just like hide it out of the way, rather than try to like fold it under and have like 8 layers of fabric to sew through and just have it be a pain in the ass. It was easier to just hand sew it. Then once that whole loop was attached one side, then I flipped everything over and top stitched. And then for the, I keep wanting to say sleeves, for the straps, there's nothing for it to attach to, so I just closed up the opening of the bias tape. Oh, although, a thing to note here, when I was attaching that like continuous loop, the top of the strap section for the dress is meant for a wider strap, so there's a wider chunk of fabric here. So I kind of had to taper it down to make it look okay, because I didn't make like a point with my pattern piece, which would have been an option. Instead of having that like squared off top edge, I could have tapered it, and that would have cut this whole part out. Again, we were improvising as we were going. This was a noodling around project. I had to decide which side of it I wanted to like taper down more, and because I didn't want to take away from like the armpit meat side of the dress, I took it off of the front and back sides of that curve. And yeah, I just laid the bias tape down, stitched it in place where I wanted it to go, and then I just trimmed down that little bit of excess fabric after the fact. And then I did that fold over and top stitching thing. So it seemed more complicated than it was, as most things I have mentioned so far, and just most things in life. So then it was time to finally do the buttons down the front. I mean the snaps. I did little plastic snaps. Buttons would have been fine. I realized that the snaps I had weren't quite the shade I remembered them being, and I don't know if I set the darker orange aside somewhere in a safe place that I will never find again, or I'll find in 2 days now that I've done this other color. So I did look through my button stash to see if I had a more perfect match color, and I would have switched to doing buttons and buttonholes, but I ended up being okay with this kind of lighter orange going down the center front. It was a good like accent piece, accent color, accent detail. Yes. So I have this really cool extendable button measuring tool, which is very fun to use, and it just makes measuring this stuff out so much easier. The one thing I do wish is that there was like a locking mechanism, so that once you had it in a certain position, had everything a certain width apart, you could like keep it there, because as I moved stuff, thankfully I had reference points from the first couple of marks I made. I just like relined it up, but sometimes I had kind of rejudge it, and I don't love that part of it, because things can get skewed pretty easily that way if you're not paying attention. But thankfully I was. Good on me for that. Measured out however many snaps. There are 14 snaps on here, or 14 sets of snaps on here, I suppose. So there's technically 28. Once I had height along the placket where all of these were going to go, I then measured in so that the snaps would be centered along the placket width. And then I just kind of went for it. I started at the bottom, which I think was smart, just so if anything went hinky, it would be the least visible one. I just poked through with the awl. I did have to do a bit of a test run to see which side overlapping was going to make the fox faces line up, because I couldn't remember from when I first figured that out, which was right side over left, which I think is traditionally how women's clothing goes anyway, because women are always right. That's how I was taught that. I had the nice flush side of the snap facing out on the right side, and then I just picked either the female or male part of the closure to go on the underside of this, and then I just kept that same configuration all the way up that side. And then I do regret not punching the holes through both the left and right side of the placket at the same time, because it made lining up the other side of the snaps more difficult. I took my time and I made it look nice. I repeated all of that on the left side, but I had the flush side of the snap like on the inside, and then the opposing piece of the closure that was going to snap into the front side all along the second side of this. And I'm pretty pleased how it came out. It's not completely perfect. I did make sure that the folded under side of the placket was like nice and flat as I went. I should have stitched it down, to be honest. I realized that when I went to hem it and I top stitched it, was like, oh, this probably could have done with some top stitching along the placket, but it's fine. Like it's gonna stay in place, but I think it would have looked a little bit cleaner and a little bit less wonkiness between a couple of the snaps. It's fine. It's a comfy summer dress. We don't need the height of couture finishing for it to be wearable. Then, right, I did a little bit of hand stitching and I took it into my room while I was watching JoJo's Bizarre Adventure with some friends last night. So yeah, I just tacked down the little end tails of the bias tape that was on the front. And then it was hemming time, where I was contemplating doing this by hand, and I'm actually really glad I did, because I like the contrasting thread color for this part, which again, I wish I had done along the placket too. I think it would have been nice. We can't live in our regrets. So I did only fold it up once because the skirt is on the shorter side and I could have folded it up one more time, but I'm happy with how this ended up looking, and it was just that little bit less work. It's fine. The edge was serged. By the way, I serged the very bottom of the dress. Probably didn't mention that part. It's finished on the inside. It's gonna be fine. So I pressed it up 1/2 inch, did a nice ironing session, just stitched it down, and then I did a little bit of extra tacking to get the bottom fold of the placket nicely in place. And that was the very last finishing bit of this dress. Let's take her for a spin, shall we? I didn't actually spin in this at all, I don't think. I went outside. It was very cold, but I wanted to show the full effect of the dress. I wore these Oxford heels, meaning I was over 6 feet tall walking around like this. But at least the ground was really hard, so it's not like the heels were sinking into the mulch or anything. So one little upside of this outfit in the wintertime, wore some like navy tights to go with it, because I didn't want to add any black into this. I know my nails are black, but you will see in a lot of the footage here and the photos that I ended up taking for the thumbnail, my hands are in my pockets, because that's the thing I want to emphasize anyway. And yeah, it's super comfortable. I think it's going to get a lot of wear. I am wearing a strapless bra underneath, which that's the one downside of having such thin straps on it. Oh, wait. There was one other thing I did. I forgot. That's giving it this little extra bit of support too. I wonder if I tackle this one more time and like tweak a couple little things, if I'd be comfortable just like not wearing a bra with this kind of dress. Because I prefer wearing them when it's super hot out. Having one less garment on wouldn't be the worst thing. The finishing of the princess seams. I can't believe I almost forgot. I just did it before I went outside, so I didn't write the note down because I was like too excited to go out there and show it off. I had thought about binding each edge of the princess seams with bias tape, and then I had considered trying to serge it, but I figured that'd be kind of a mess. Had I serged it first, serged each side, pressed it open, and then done the notching, that would have been good. So I think I'm going to do that next time. Because again, normally the princess seam is hidden behind a lining, so I don't have to worry about it being exposed and fraying a bunch. I found this iron-on hem tape after discussing some of my options with my lovely friend Grant, who just posted a video on their channel actually of some witch hat making. Link in the description if you want to check it out, because I'm just excited to see anything that they make. But yeah, we talked about some options, and a very helpful phrase was said, which was, whatever way you decide to do it is going to be the right way. It's going to work. It's going to be fine. You know what you're doing. Like, very helpful things to hear, and just things I'm really bad at telling myself. I found this hem tape. It was actually part of this like bundle that had bias tape and piping and some like lingerie elastic and some fold over elastic that I got at Goodwill. Everything was in the package. So yeah, I've never used this before. This was super cool. It's pretty stiff, so I had to finagle it a bit in a couple spots. I just lined it up along the center of the princess seam, and yes, there are still exposed raw edges here, but if those fray, they're gonna have a stopping point because there is glue adhered to the rest of that seam allowance. I'm not worried about it. It's gonna be fine. I can trim that off if I need to as well, if it is getting frayy. It's obviously not like boning or something, but it is giving that little bit more structure to the princess seam. That was also fun to experiment with. And yeah, that is the project. Finally, it's been a long time coming. It is done. I'm very happy with how it came out. I'm glad I took my time with it. This was over the course of like 4 days, I think. I didn't have one entire whole dedicated day to working on this, unfortunately, where I typically do have at least one full set aside day just for the sewing project, but I'm also trying to get more ambitious with my sewing projects, and this was certainly one of those. And the only reason I'm able to take a whole day and more to work on projects like this and put videos together about them is because of everyone over on Patreon. They are what keeps this ship afloat. I genuinely wouldn't be able to do this without y'all. And an additional thing, if Patreon is like a little too overwhelming for you because it's like a monthly subscription, if you are interested in helping me pay for the fabric I had to emergency go out and purchase for something that we'll talk about in a future video, hopefully that'll get done next week, but giving myself a little bit of grace here. If you want to help fund things like that, I do have a coffee page, or if you just want to buy me a coffee, that's also fine. That is always linked below. And yeah, it is because of the support I get from everybody here that we get to keep doing this. I've been here for years and years and years now, and I can't believe I still get to do my favorite thing and get to share it with y'all. Thank you, anybody that watches here and hangs out and comments. Thank you all so much for joining the live stream I did. I know I say this every year, but I'm going to try to do them monthly and like just pick a day and schedule it and just make it happen. It's gonna be fine. It's like I'm making dedicated plans with y'all. I can make that happen. As long as my head is in a reasonable space to be on camera, because I think we went for almost 4 hours, where that is part of the difficulty the past couple of years, where it's been a rough go recently. But we're into the new year. Things are gonna be okay. We're gonna make a bunch of things. We're gonna get through it together. And yeah, if you have like goals for your new year, please share them below, because I'm excited to hear about projects everybody else is working on. That's it for me. I will see you back here with another video next Friday. Thank you so much for hanging out. Being a ham-fisted ogre per usual. It's 17 goddamn degrees out. You're welcome.